Yes. All right, we'll go to the phone.
Sorry about that. I heard the intro and then the video went out, and I was like, well, if I can't have the video, I might as well just call in. So
all right.
Thank you for accommodating my tech woes.
All right. Well, the part you might have missed was I'm handing it off to you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for hosting me tonight, and it's so wonderful to meet so many of you and also see some familiar faces. It's really wonderful to chat with you about the work that we're building here with our community campaign. As noted, I am an activist. I am a local PTA mom and have been doing progressive political work in Washington State for 2 decades. So it feels humbling to find ourselves on the other side of the primary with 51% of the vote. There were 7 folks in the race, which, as we know, happens with open seats. And when we announced at the end of January, we had no way to know that we would be organizing a campaign with the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic that we are still weathering, as well as the Black Lives Matter movement finally turning and having the attention it deserves and the weight that it deserves for the type of change that folks have been waiting to see for a long time. So it's really amazing to find that our neighbors are supportive of a community campaign. We have been doing organizing online, of course, with the pandemic. One of the pieces that's been hard is not being able to meet in person. Of course, ideally we'd all be meeting in person right now. So really glad that we still have these ways of meeting and convening. I am running because my neighbors asked me to. I've been in the work a long time. I previously served on Seattle City Council, and while I was on City Council for the 51 days I was there, 48 of those days was focused on the city budget. And in the time I was there, I helped introduce the employee hours tax. I am proud of what that policy had as an option for revenue. It's been exciting to see the Jumpstart pass at the city level here 3 years later and see the promise of what is possible with increased revenue at the city level. And I would love to see that change at the state level as well. Progressive revenue and shifts and making sure those who make the most in our state are paying their share is one of my highest priorities, because as COVID-19 has shown us, if we don't take this moment to really create change in the way we're doing things, we're not going to be able to mend all of the fault lines that are now surfacing with the pandemic. And as you all know, considerations as urbanists, it's really, really clear that structurally we are not set up for folks to weather this crisis very well right now. And that points to a lot of change we can make. And for me, in the 37th, we are the most diverse district in all of Washington State. The Central District, Chinatown International District, Pioneer Square carve out where most of the urban native community serving organizations are housed. Skyway and Renton, which has the densest number of Black families in the state. The priority for Green New Deal, transit infrastructure, housing density, increased affordability, and creating relief for both our neighbors who are renters. We're a majority renter district, as well as those who've been in the district a long time and are trying to hold on to a little piece of what they can own. Needs to be prioritized. So excited to chat with you all today. Thank you again for having me.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that intro. We have some questions in the chat, but I was going to try to sneak in a couple before we get to those. As we noted, you were an activist, active in the Block the Bunker and No New Youth Jail movement. With the growth of the Black Lives Movement and calls to reform our criminal justice system, how do you hope to take that activist momentum into the legislature, and what do you hope to accomplish at that level?
That's a really wonderful question. What's exciting about having 51% of the vote coming out of the primary is we got to sit as a team and really think, how are we going to now organize with governance on the other side as a focus? And so one of the things we're doing right now is building an accountability council. We're contacting 50 different nonprofit, not-for-profit, and advocacy groups throughout the 37th district. Our goal is to, along with these accountability partners, build an agenda and set of priorities for the 2021 legislative session, and to focus on what it's going to look like to govern together as a district. One of the pieces that I really want to carry through from activism is that work is done as a collective. There is no one person who has created the level of change that we need to see. It's always taken us all working together. And it's been exciting to see what it's looked like when neighbors work together collectively at changes that are brought forward. I hope folks have been taking careful attention to the King County changes to the charter recently. I was really excited to see clauses like the right to return clause and other considerations that really are huge for our neighbors in places like unincorporated Skyway. And the pressure of coalition and activism from folks like the Skyway Coalition, Skyway Collective, and others in the South End like Africa Town and King County Equity Now, I think is really shifting attention where it needs to be on policy change and revenue and investments in community-based solutions. So those are all priorities I want to carry through. Another big piece is that I know it also means we're going to have to hold the line on some bad policy and bad stuff that's going to come up. There's already a lot of murmurs about an austerity budget. To be fair, structurally, our budget is built for austerity budgets. All of the preemptions protect a lot of larger corporation status quo policy. And the places where you can find quote unquote relief in the budget, unfortunately, is disproportionately impacting health and human services for our neighbors. So to hold the line on austerity cuts and make sure that any priority with tax revenue that gets us dollars in the door right now, we have relief 2 years down the road by building progressive revenue solutions. Because in my experience over 20 years, good policy is only as good as our ability to actually make it real in people's lives, and you need dollars and cents to do that. So it's going to be a combination of good policy and making sure there's dollars on the table to invest in those solutions that we're going to be able to prioritize with our neighbors. So excited to organize with lots of folks on this call as well.
Well, piggybacking off of that, and you just said progressive revenue, which has always been a struggle in our state. And, you know, we just passed progressive revenue in Washington, Seattle, and then also saw Amazon announce a major expansion just across, you know, the lake where they will not be subject to that tax. How do you envision progressive revenue at a state level, and how do you hope to accomplish that? When I know that's been a perpetual problem getting it through.
Yes, it's been frustrating to find ourselves the last few years having Democratic majorities in both the House and the Senate, and still finding that a progressive revenue solution that gives relief to everyday folks and make sure that the richest in our state are paying their share has not been passed yet. As folks probably know, we've had a decade now in conversation about what closing the capital gains loopholes would look like in Washington state. I think that should be number one priority. It's the lowest hanging fruit. It's money that makes money. And quite frankly, money is not hurting right now with the crisis of the pandemic. People are. And we need to find relief there. The biggest consideration with revenue is going to be twofold for 2021. One, we need to pass things like closing capital gains loopholes, getting closer to what an income tax solution could look like. I would love to see the working families tax credit move through. But as you noted, the caucuses have not had the robust and bold conversations they've needed to have. And what I'm glad to say is, as I'm talking to more and more legislators on both chambers of the legislature, the tone of conversations is quite different even than a year ago. And I know that because I've been in coalition with folks like Owen for Washington and others who've been on the front lines of this work around progressive revenue for a long time. So I've been talking to these folks in different capacities for many years. So that gives promise, I think, of solutions at the state level. And to the point of the example you just gave, what we can't do is open up possibilities. I want to see more loosening of preemptions at the state level to give more local control to city and county level government to tax in ways that they see fit. I think that's really important. That said, we cannot then create a situation where communities, cities next to each other are competing against each other because we don't have uniform considerations for equity at the state level. So we need to really make these solutions happen at the state level so that we have revenue solutions all across Washington state. And when I think about impacts in communities where we are in a state where not one county has enough affordable housing, I don't want to see different communities having revenue to fix that solution and others not. Everyone in Yakima, Bellevue, everywhere should have that kind of revenue, not just Seattle. The fact that Seattle has finally found an option that we think is going to weather the courts, as folks probably are following, we're already going to be anticipating a number of court cases around the Jumpstart solution at the city level, which also takes time away from implementing the policy and getting the revenue in the door. And what I have found when the winds change in caucus, the way to get things over the finish line is to have folks organized in concert towards a common solution, and to make sure that those who feel that they can't be bold can recognize how they can be and talk to their constituents. There's just too much, I think, overall in Olympia of sort of a firewall between legislators and our communities. One thing that, there's rumor that there may be a rules change that would make it so that we were doing a remote session, which would mean we'd all be legislating from our own communities, our own neighborhoods with our neighbors. That could be a game changer, I think, in pushing forward some revenue solutions and organizing our neighbors around that. And it's going to take folks organizing all together, I think, to get it over the finish line, even though the tone is shifting. So making sure it's focused on actually progressive solutions is one piece, and two, organizing our neighbors and legislators within caucus so that they can have enough of those votes to get it over the finish line successfully.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question and then we can move on to the ones in the chat. You mentioned your district is one of the, if not the most diverse district in the state. It also, I think many of your constituents could be at risk for displacement as our city continues to grow, and housing costs and housing security are major issues. How would you hope to address them at the state level?
It's a great question. Yes, so 37th is the most diverse legislative district as it was drawn in 2010. We're going to, of course, see with the census count how demographics have shifted in our state. And I'm excited to see how complete a count we have so that everywhere we know accurately where our neighbors are. So important. And with that, the diversity in this district is not accidental. Quite frankly, it's built on racist redlining policy. Our proximity to each other as diverse communities is because of anti-Blackness, anti-Japanese sentiment in World War II, and on and on and on. So you're right, we are disproportionately impacted by gentrification because of the legacy of those types of explicit segregative policies that shaped our communities. And it's also starved our communities of resources for a very long time. So what it means to move beyond equality into equity so that the areas of our state and the communities in our state that have been intentionally under-resourced are actually brought up to the same level as other parts of our communities and state is going to be a huge priority. And thinking through models of anti-gentrification is going to need to be a huge priority. You're correct that displacement has really shifted the district already. As many folks know, the Central District used to be the most densely Black community in the state. That has shifted over the last 25 years, and now Skyway, Renton is. And the makeup of our neighbors under the category of Black has shifted dramatically as well. We have more immigrant and refugee neighbors from current African diaspora who make up those communities as well, which is really amazing and wonderful. And we have a long legacy of immigrants and refugees and Indigenous people who've been here for generations, making up the diversity of this neighborhood. So considerations at the state level, we need to continue to address zoning policy that allows density. We have a patchwork of density proposals within the 37th district, depending on if you're in Seattle City proper, what neighborhoods in Seattle City proper, and then or whether you're in South King County or unincorporated Skyway, which all have different considerations, particularly Skyway because it is unincorporated, which removes a lot of protections that those residents would usually have in incorporation. So when I think of state level policy, the renters' rights package that we should have passed last spring in 2019, it's part of why our neighbors asked me to run. I am saddened that we do not have many of the protections that were part of that renters' rights bundle. I would like to see that passed. I would like to see a priority for transit infrastructure. Too many of our neighbors are finding themselves traveling long distances to get to and from work and being decentralized from the center of their lives, which is also driving up what contributes to the poor air quality in our district. So anything that we can do to complete ST3 and bring the promise of transit infrastructure to this, particularly the 37th overlap with that infrastructure, is huge, and anything we can do to investment and accelerate that timeline. And I think those kind of infrastructure project priorities are a great way for government also to invigorate our economy right now as we're going to rebuild from COVID. So I'd really love to see priority there. I would also like to see right to return clauses at the state level added as protections for folks. It makes a huge difference as you're continuing to upgrade and create new housing within communities to make sure that the folks there aren't being pushed out by all the newness. And, you know, quite frankly, these communities built a lot of resilience and beauty out of these communities despite the racist circumstances that put us all together in the South End, and they deserve to be there. Elders who've been there and built up the community, their grandchildren who are now the new organizers and business owners, everyone deserves to stay, and we should have room for everyone, and those sorts of policies and clauses make a huge difference. I would also like to see priority for housing that addresses houselessness, because of course one of the biggest impacts for gentrification is the fact that we don't have income equality, and that has a huge disproportionality of folks who are impacted by houselessness. And we have a disproportionate number of folks impacted in our district as well, because we're a hyper-urban area. So what it is to build housing so that we have enough shelter beds, and then also priority for housing that folks can move into that also has wraparound services, because often folks aren't homeless just because of the equation of housing. There's also other impacts and pressures. So all of those things we have to think about simultaneously. And the big thing for our district is we have a lot of folks who own, but we also have a lot of folks who rent. So thinking simultaneously at the state level of how we support both is a huge priority for me and for our neighbors.
Great, thanks for that wonderful answer. So I want to move on to some questions from attendees. The first one here, I'm curious if you think that the D43 election has bearing on your priorities. I.e., can you accomplish more with either CHOP or Lascelles in the seat? I'm asking because I want to understand how leftist coalitions building gets derailed or not.
I want to understand, so I understand how what kind of coalition?
How leftist coalition building gets derailed or not.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, so I do think the outcome of the 43rd has an impact on decisions in the legislature. I think decisions all across a number of districts in Washington State will have a huge impact. I'm keeping a close eye on Tanisha Harris's race in Clark County for folks who aren't following that race. That's a very important one as well. And I actually personally endorsed Sheree for the position in the 43rd. I was asked by Sheree. They and I have done a lot of activism and coalition work together. And, you know, we are a unique state. We had the same Speaker of the House in Washington State for 2 decades, unheard of. We are wholly unique in that. It's the longest serving Speaker of the House that we had. 10 of those 20 years, we had a shift in who had majority rule in our legislature. We saw huge attrition of policy passing in the time that Republicans had control of the Senate, the House, and then just the Senate. And considerations around that, I think, are always huge. It's wonderful to have legacy members. I think in this moment, the balance of new members who are going to bring in creativity, new ideas and ways of doing things, and those who've been in the legislature a number of years and are bringing the experience from previous cycles. I think the balance of those two things is really important. That's why I've been really excited to be talking to Senator Bob Hasagawa about the state bank and other solutions as I think through revenue and how we're going to generate the kind of loan infrastructure we're going to need as well to rebuild our economy. So yes, I think the 43rd is very important at play. I've made an endorsement in what I think is a direction I would like to see the 43rd move in for a number of reasons. And the part around how left movements get distracted or disoriented, I don't remember quite which word was used. I think overall, the consideration of how long we've had to fight for certain fights is sobering. You know, there's a lot that's passed in Washington state that we've had to do on the ballot because legislators just weren't able to get it done in the legislature. I would like to see that trend change because, quite frankly, the most progressive policy that we have passed over the last decade, we've had to spend millions of dollars to do it on the ballot. And that was my previous role before I was the ED of NARAL Pro-Choice Washington. I was the political director of Progress Alliance of Washington. And so I was part of some of those independent expenditures and those campaigns. You know, to have I-940 pass because neighbors who'd been impacted by police violence came together to pass that policy was huge. And I don't know that that kind of policy could have passed through the legislature. But it's disappointing to know that the HEAL Act didn't pass through the legislature, that we had two goes at a carbon tax policy that would have had a wholly different equation if the second one had passed about what revenue we would have for consideration at play now to solve a lot of the problems that we have. Marriage equity had to happen on the ballot as well. So yeah, I think for the left, thinking through those fights, how long they are and how you endure them both in the streets and within policy infrastructure, it's a weighty balance. And Olympia is quite isolated for many folks. I know what it is to trek down there. I've taken folks to give testimony. It's not a system that is easy for everyday people to be a part of. And I'd like to see that change as well. So those are some of my thoughts on why the left sometimes loses momentum on the fight towards the win.
Great.
I hope that answered that.
If you have a follow-up question, you can throw it in the chat and we'll hopefully get to it. I missed a question based on a discussion we were having before you joined. There was talk of the convention center running out of money and possibly needing a state bailout. And what are your thoughts on that? If it comes before you?
For the Washington State Convention Center?
Yeah, they're doing that major expansion, but with the cratering of hotel tax revenue, I know they've got a giant hole to fill. Yes.
I mean, that's, I think, a great example of these ways right now structurally that we have tried to build infrastructure of sand with some of our tax policy, because that's a great example, right? We were betting on hotels never slowing down the stream of people coming through downtown. The rolling impact, of course, of the convention center being closed for so long and the rolling revenue impacts across the region, quite frankly, not just the city of Seattle, are huge. I am open to options. The reason I think a state bank is a wonderful solution is because the scale of these sorts of crises, if you didn't have to think about it as a bailout, as much as what it is to have an infrastructure that could actually respond with the scale of loan or consideration that folks need for those sorts of considerations is huge. So no, I'm not open to a bailout. I'm open to thinking through what borrowing solutions and other solutions are to bolster the convention center. I would like a lot of consideration about what types of jobs are offered there. I mean, the whole infrastructure for hospitality jobs, of course, is sobering. You know, to have Unite Here 8 have 90% of their workers impacted within the first 30 days of the pandemic crisis, I think gives us an idea of how sobering this is. The reason I'm hesitant to think through all of those peak considerations in 2021 is that I don't think the end of the pandemic is anywhere near. I think we're going to be in this some level of crisis for at least another year, with projections from what scientists are saying globally, and certainly with what response has looked like within the infrastructure of the United States, which means that you have another year of considerations of what the closure of a convention center is going to look like and the impacts of downtown. So I would be hesitant to continue to invest in infrastructure when we don't know if it's the infrastructure that our economy is going to need over the long haul. So those are my first thoughts. Would need to see specific proposals and what sort of allowances were being given, and who is going to be protected or not by considerations of where those dollars go. Because what I don't want is to bolster corporations that are already doing well or sitting on profit margins while their workers suffer, while everyday people are still hurting. And we have very little money to move around right now, quite frankly, as a state. And we have a lot of things that need attention. People should get attention first before buildings or other infrastructure, for sure.
Great. Could you talk a little bit more about, you've mentioned a state bank a couple of times. Could you speak a little bit more about that concept and your thoughts on it?
Yes. So the thing that I find exciting about policy, particularly policy at a state level, is that government is uniquely positioned to actually be an institution, wielded, I think, right, with really strong core values that can actually meet the scale of need at really large scales. And a state bank concept is something that Senator Bob Hasagawa has stewarded for many years. I'll totally help look that up, honey. My youngest is coming in for some help on something on chatting with you all.
Oh, yes. Yeah,
You'll hear just whispers in the background. And so the idea is that we would have a state bank. So there's been, conversations about municipal level broadband. It's a similar idea. So these sort of institutions that right now are wholly in the private market, what would it look like to have a public version of that institution at a government scale size? North Dakota has a public bank option that's very interesting model to reflect on. The potential of it, of course, is that the scale of what you would have to lend and move through the economy is huge. There are projections for Washington State's economy where with a state level bank, we could have somewhere between 150 and 200 billion with a B dollars for investment in infrastructure. And with public dollars being lent out and coming back in, you would want to think of terms that would look something closer to a co-op model than commercial bank models. So it also could open up what lending models we had available for folks, what protections we had for other types of financial institutions, what kind of protections and loan potentially would have for other public institutions, right? What would it look like for the state of Washington to become the first state that had statewide statewide utility of internet, for instance? A state bank could actually have the lending and borrowing potential to compete on an international market to build that kind of infrastructure. That's sort of the scale of vision you could start thinking about. If you actually had a public institution at the state level that could actually be providing the dollars that you needed for those investments. So that's the idea of a state bank. Happy to chat about it more. I'm going to be working more and more. We're actually going to have within our campaign at electkht.org, you can keep track. We do community vision sessions, which are opportunities on Zoom. We get together, we usually orient the conversation about a given topic, have a couple speakers on with me, we chat, do Q&A. It's a great way to plug in. And we're going to do one on progressive revenue in the state bank idea. So would love folks to join us on that, plug in, ask questions. It's going to be a good time to talk about, really dreaming about what it thinks to really think differently about these institutions and how we're going to rebuild institutions, quite frankly, that should be serving our state and communities in ways that right now the institutions we have aren't able to. So yeah, good stuff.
Excellent. So I want to ask for your thoughts on the lieutenant governor race with Inslee's possible appointment to a Biden administration. that kind of sleepy, what's normally a sleepy position could become very exciting.
Yes, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to find ourselves with the two finishers we have. I think it's bringing robust conversation about, to the point of the person who asked the question, about what this role looks like. I think it's sometimes an overlooked role within government, and it does, I think, have a priority because of the potential that it offers. And what you have, right, is an interesting representation of the spectrum of what Democrats look like in Washington State. Again, we have, I think, an example of someone who's been in our legislature many, many years, representing a district that has shifted dramatically in the time that they represented it. Someone who's newer and has brought some, you know, it's very specific progressive energy. So I'm excited to see the results. I think, like everyone, it was interesting to see, again, a process where there was, you know, this open process and a lot of folks, and see who's risen to the top. Always what's weighing on me right now is considerations of how the executive branch is going to show up in governance right now. It was very sobering to see the mayor at the city level in Seattle veto the last budget consideration. The weight of executive power, I think, is going to be weighing very, very heavily, particularly in 2021. I don't know what's going to be happening at the federal level with the presidency, but I don't think it's going to be a clean transfer of power. That's what my gut's telling me. And I have a lot of folks on the national level who are planning a lot of legal infrastructure for that consideration. So I know that I'm not the only one who has that consideration. So, you know, ultimately what happens with who our governor ultimately is, Inslee, I think it's pretty clear is going to be our governor. We don't know what the future holds. I've heard the appointment rumor. I have no idea if it's true or not. But whoever holds that, what weight we put on the executive to make decisions that align with people and planet over profit is going to be very, very, very important at the state level. That's for sure.
All right, thank you. So we have another question. What are your thoughts on banning single-family zoning in urban areas? I'm envisioning something, the question asker is referring to something like what Oregon passed, which allowed for required higher densities in single-family, in what is now single-family zoning in larger cities throughout the state.
No, what I wanted was mermaid pictures.
Yes, no, I'm very excited about that possibility. I think structurally that would look really, really different in Washington State than it does with Oregon because of some lack of similarity we have with other structural pieces with law. So that's a consideration, you know, not always can we, I think it's wonderful to look at other states for models, and not always does it translate because of the setup we have. And I think, you know, of course, in Washington State, we have a lot of constitutional preemption things on the state level that we're going to have to loosen up to open up the possibilities. I think, right, the thing I'm excited about with the policy is that it right sizes the reaction that we're going to have to think of if we really want to be talking in modes of equity. The biggest difference, I think, with what policy looks like with equality versus equity is that for governance for a long time has had this thing where we give everyone the same amount all across the board and they're all going to be fine. And that's just not true. Many communities are in a deficit. And quite frankly, we had laws on the books for years and years and years, and continue to have laws that say we can't build density. And that's what's created the crisis that we have now. Is it too hard to flip? I don't know. Is it something that we may need in the temporary until we can rebalance this thing? It very well could be. And so that's the thing I'm excited about, that sort of policy. And I know for Washington State, we have to start having a conversation that's actually a statewide conversation about density. And I say that because Seattle has been the epicenter of that conversation. And what that looks like then in state governance is that it takes all the oxygen in the room from other parts of the state being able to also be part of that conversation. I think the state level G&A offers a lot of solutions and opportunities for us to build on, with considerations coupled around a lot of that could do a lot of promise for our planet as well with how that building happens. I'm really excited about what density offers. I want to start having a really explicit conversation about funding hyper